time stresses, stories heal. Hey there, friend. I'm Alex. Is the silence of your room feeling a little too loud, a little too heavy tonight? Sometimes, when the world goes quiet, our deepest doubts and anxieties get the absolute loudest. I know that agonizing feeling intimately. Let these unsettling stories act like a shield against your own thoughts tonight. To keep the atmosphere flawless, deeply relaxing, and completely uninterrupted for the next few hours, my high-quality digital twin will take over the narration while I rest my voice. Drop a comment with your location and what's keeping you awake. Turn down the lights and let us begin together. The Keeper Stays. This is the story of a woman named Clara Marsh, a grief counselor, who took a volunteer position at a historic Maine Island lighthouse in the November after her mother's death. The mother she had not spoken to in 11 years, whose last voicemail she never returned. What she found on that island was not what she expected grief to look like. It was older, it had been waiting longer, and it recognized something in her the moment the boat touched the dock. The ferry captain told me the island only had 2 seasons, and that both of them were the same season, and that the season was fog. He said it the way people say things they have said so many times that the words have worn smoothly, the way river stones go smooth. And I understood that he was not trying to be poetic. He was trying to warn me. I was sitting at the stern with my single bag between my feet and a thermos of coffee that had already gone cold, and the mainland had been gone for 20 minutes. And all around the boat there was only gray water, gray sky, and the particular gray of late November fog that feels less like weather and more like the absence of everything that is not gray. I am 39 years old. My name is Clara Marsh. I am, or was, a grief counselor working out of Portland, and when my supervisor suggested I take a leave of absence after my mother's death, I said I did not need to. I said I was fine. I said it with the particular precision of someone who knew exactly how unpersuasive she sounded. 3 weeks later, I filled out the volunteer application for the Aldrich Island Light Preservation Society. The position was simple enough on paper. 1 winter caretaker, October through March, to occupy the keeper's quarters and monitor the historic structure. There was no electricity beyond a generator for heat. There was no cell service. There was a radio. There was the fog bell, which still worked, triggered automatically by sensors in the tower. And there was the light itself, which had been restored the previous spring by a team of volunteers who had then, to a person, declined to stay the winter. I told myself I was going for the solitude. I told myself I needed to write something. I had been meaning to write for years, some kind of account of what grief counseling actually felt like from the inside, the accumulated weight of other people's losses that a counselor carries home and never quite unpacks. I had a laptop. I had good intentions. What I did not tell myself, because I was not yet ready to, was that my mother's name had been Ellen, and that she had kept a journal her entire adult life, and that those journals had been mailed to me in a flat-rate priority box by my aunt in Gloucester, and that the box was sitting on my kitchen table, sealed, and that I had not opened it. I had carried the box to Portland. I had moved it from table to counter to closet. I had, on 2 occasions, cut the tape with a kitchen knife and then replaced it with new tape, methodically, deliberately, the way you board up a window before a storm. I understood, professionally, what I was doing. I understood it and kept doing it anyway. The ferry captain had a name stitched on his jacket, Roy. He did not speak again until we were within sight of the dock, at which point he appeared at my shoulder and said that the house was warm, because the previous caretaker had left the wood stove going, and that the wood was stacked under the eastern lean-to, and that he would be back in 2 weeks. I asked what I should do if something went wrong. He told me to use the radio. I asked what channel. He said I would figure it out. The dock was granite. old and salt-stained, and my first step onto it produced a sound that rang longer than it should have. A dull resonance, almost hollow. The fog was so complete that I could not see the lighthouse tower from the dock. I could hear the fog bell. I could feel the vibration of it in my sternum. A slow, patient pulse, 6 beats and then silence, 6 beats and then silence, and I stood there with my bag in one hand and the dead thermos in the other, and I thought about the voicemail. I thought, my mother called me 11 years ago and said she needed to talk to me about something, and I was in the middle of my 2nd year of graduate school and I was exhausted and I was foolish, and I said I would call her back, and then I did not call her back. Not that week, and not the week after, and not in 11 years. And now she was dead, and the box was on my kitchen table in Portland with new tape over the cut tape. And I was standing on a granite dock in the fog in November, listening to a bell that had no one to ring it. I almost got back on the ferry. Roy was already reversing from the dock. The path to the keeper's house was marked with white-painted stones set at intervals, and I followed them through the fog, which was so thick by this point that each stone appeared only when I was nearly on top of it, emerging from the gray one at a time. The grass on either side of the path had gone to straw, and it hissed softly in a wind I could not feel on my face. The smell of the island was salt and cold mud and something underneath. Something I noticed without being able to name, something that was almost pine, but earthier, darker, like pine after a long rain has gotten into the wood. The keeper's house was white clapboard, 2 stories, with a red door whose paint had bubbled and peeled in long strips. The wood pile was where Roy had said it would be, under the eastern lean-to, dry and neatly stacked by someone who had taken care over the arrangement. The generator was in a small outbuilding to the north, already running. The house was unlocked. Inside, the wood stove in the main room was going, and the warmth of it hit me before I was fully through the door. A genuine, uncomplicated warmth, the kind that comes from a fire and not from a thermostat. And for a moment I simply stood in the doorway and absorbed it. The main room had a table, 4 chairs, a narrow couch with a wool blanket folded over one arm, and a bookcase filled with the accumulated reading of 100 previous caretakers. Field guides, paperback thrillers missing their covers, 1 volume of Thoreau warped beyond use by what had once been moisture. On the table, someone had left a half-burned candle and a box of matches. On the wall above the stove there was a framed list, handwritten on yellowed paper, of the official keepers of Aldrich Island Light, dated from 1843 to 1987, when the light was automated. There were 14 names. I put my bag down. I went to the stove and held my hands out to it. I thought about whether I had turned the burner off in my apartment in Portland, and told myself I probably had, and told myself to stop thinking about it. The fog bell rang 6 times. Then it stopped. I went to the window. The glass was old, slightly wavy, and through it the fog seemed to move. Not the way fog moves, slowly, in mass, but in currents and streaks, the way smoke moves through a closed room when something disturbs the air. I watched for a while. The bell rang again. 6 strokes. Silence. I found the radio, checked the battery, and set it on the table next to the candle. I found the kitchen. A narrow room with a gas range and a small pantry someone had partially stocked. Canned soup, coffee, oats, a tin of crackers, a jar of honey with a crust of crystallized sugar around the lid. I heated soup on the stove and ate it standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the fog which had darkened now as the light behind it lowered. By 4 in the afternoon it was completely dark outside, and completely dark meant that the lighthouse beam was visible. A pale cylinder of light that swept across my window every 8 seconds, exact and patient and indifferent. I spread the wool blanket on the couch and lay down without meaning to sleep. I lay there listening to the bell, and the beam crossing the window every 8 seconds. And what I had told myself was the wind moving through the grass outside. And what I had told myself was just the house settling. A lie, I repeated, until I almost believed it. until I was almost asleep, until the moment just before sleep when I became aware, in the way that the body knows things before the mind agrees to know them, that the smell of that almost pine, that darker than pine smell, had moved from outside the house to inside it. I told myself the wind had come in when I opened the door. I slept. Something on the island had already decided I was not a stranger. The wool blanket was gone from the couch when I woke. Not fallen, not displaced by restless sleep. Gone, folded, and placed with surgical precision on the back of the single wooden chair beside the stove, which had been fed at some point in the night and was still burning, low and steady, the way a fire burns when someone has tended it and know exactly how much wood to add. I lay on the couch for a long time before I sat up. The first gray light was coming through the east-facing kitchen window, and the fog bell was silent. Silenced by dawn, I realized later, by the sensor reading enough ambient light to stand the equipment down. And the silence it left was so complete and so specific that it had a texture of its own, not peaceful, deliberate. The silence of a room where someone has just stopped speaking. I went to the stove and put my hands close to it without touching the iron. I had slept in my clothes. My neck was stiff. I had a headache behind my left eye that I recognized, professionally, as the particular headache that comes from crying in your sleep. The kind of grief that waits for the body to surrender consciousness before it does its work. I did not remember dreaming. The chair with the blanket on it was positioned at a slight angle to the rest of the room, not dramatically, not enough that I could have said definitively that it had been moved, just enough that it would catch the eye of anyone standing where I was standing, which was exactly where I was standing. I put the kettle on. I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee, both hands around the mug, and looked at what the island was willing to show me in the early light. The fog had pulled back overnight, not fully, but enough that I could see perhaps 40 yards in any direction. The grass was brown and flat, beaten down by cold and salt wind, and the path of white stones curved away from the house toward the tower, which I could now see for the first time. A granite cylinder, maybe 60 feet tall, its paint gone to a dull cream, its lantern room dark now that the beam had shut down for the day. Around the base of the tower, someone had planted a garden at some point, long enough ago that the garden had become indistinguishable from the surrounding ground except for the faint geometry of its border stones, half sunk into the earth, visible only because the frost had pushed them sideways. My mother had kept a garden. I had not thought about that in years. She had grown things that had no business growing in coastal New Hampshire. Fig trees she wrapped in burlap every October, dahlias she dug up and stored in the cellar in paper bags, a kitchen herb garden that smelled so specifically of her that walking into the kitchen in summer was sometimes too much. I had grown up in that smell. I had left it. I finished the coffee and did not make more. The day's work was inspection. A checklist the Preservation Society had left on the kitchen table, attached to a clipboard with a length of rusted baling wire. Every door, every window, every stone course of the tower exterior, every fitting in the lantern room, every beam and joist of the keeper's house. The checklist was 11 pages long and had been assembled over decades by multiple hands, some entries printed, some handwritten, one section in pencil so faint it required standing in direct light to read. The oldest entries dated from 1961. Some items had been checked off in ink and then marked through with a different color, then rechecked, then marked through again. I began at the south end of the house and worked north. The 2 upstairs bedrooms had not been used, as far as I could tell, in several seasons. The mattresses were bare, the windows latched, the air holding that particular quality of cold that belongs to rooms that have been sealed long enough that the cold has become structural. Not the cold of a draft, but the cold of accumulated absence. One bedroom had a wardrobe with a mirror on the inside of the door, and when I opened it to check for moisture damage, I saw my reflection appear suddenly in the dim room, and the instinct to step back was so immediate and so physical that I was against the opposite wall before I understood what I was reacting to. My own face. Just my own face. I wrote down, wardrobe secure, no moisture evident, mirror intact. I moved on. The tower door was at the base of the granite cylinder. A steel plate set in an iron frame, painted the same dull cream as the exterior. The society's key was on a ring with 2 others, and it took me several attempts to find the correct one. The door swung inward and released a column of cold air that was dense enough to feel like a presence, like something displacing me as it came out, and the smell of the tower was iron and stone, and a particular dampness that had no salt in it. A deeply inland smell, a cave smell, inside a structure that stood on a rock in the ocean. The spiral staircase was iron, and it rang under my boots with each step. I counted the steps without intending to count them. 62. At each landing, a narrow window looked out over the water, and through each one the fog appeared at a different density, thicker near the water, thinner near the top, so that by the time I reached the lantern room, the world outside the glass was the closest to visible it had been since my arrival. A pewter surface of water, a horizon, the suggestion of the mainland so distant it might have been a cloud. The lantern room was cold and clean and smelled of the lamp oil that had not been burned there in nearly 40 years. The Fresnel lens, smaller here than at Seguin, second order rather than first, I had read in the Society's materials, caught what thin light existed and held it in its prisms, suspended but inert. I stood beside it and looked out at the water, and I thought, my mother kept a journal every single day for as long as I could remember. She wrote in it before bed. She wrote in it while her coffee cooled. She wrote in it, presumably, in the last weeks of her life, when the cancer had progressed enough that she could no longer drive, when she was dependent on my aunt and on nurses, and on the care of people who were not her daughter, because her daughter had not returned a phone call 11 years ago, and had then simply not called again. The fog bell engaged. The sound of it directly beneath me was not the muffled pulse I had heard from the house. It was a concussion. 6 separate physical events, each one arriving through the soles of my boots and up into my sternum, and the 6th one reverberating in the glass of the lantern room long after the bell had stopped, a tone that descended slowly through frequencies I felt more than heard, and then was gone. I gripped the railing of the lens housing until the vibration in my hand stopped. On the way down, I counted the steps again. 62 on the ascent. I counted 63 on the descent. I stood at the bottom of the staircase and counted the risers above me from the ground. 62. The door was open behind me, and the daylight came in at a low angle and threw a long shadow from my feet up the first several steps, and I stood there with the discrepancies sitting in my mind. 62, 63, 62. The way you stand in a room when you cannot remember why you entered it, waiting for the purpose to reassert itself. I wrote on the checklist, staircase intact. No structural concerns noted. I did not write down the number. Outside, the fog had returned to its full depth while I was in the tower. The morning's brief visibility closed over again, and the pathstones led me back to the house one at a time the way they had the day before. In the kitchen, I opened the pantry and looked at the cans of soup and the tin of crackers and the jar of honey. And I thought about whether I was hungry, and decided I was not, and heated soup anyway, because eating was a task with a shape to it, a beginning and a middle and an end, and I was finding that tasks with shapes were easier than ours without them. The checklist said the cellar should be inspected before the end of the first week. The cellar door was in the kitchen floor, a wood-planked hatch with an iron ring, and I lifted it and looked down into the dark and then let it close again. Not now, I thought. Tomorrow. The afternoon passed in small work. I oiled the door hinges, which the checklist specified. I tested the generator's fuel level and found it lower than expected, which I noted on the checklist in the space provided. I found in the bottom drawer of the bookcase in the main room a logbook, not a society logbook, but an older one, bound in cloth the color of dried blood, its cover warped but its pages intact. The entries were handwritten, decades of them, by different hands. The oldest visible entry was from 1914. The most recent was dated 1987, in the handwriting of the last official keeper before automation. The final entry read, "The bell will ring without me now. I am not certain it ever needed me." I set the logbook on the table beside the radio. That evening, by the light of the candle in the stove, the wool blanket around my shoulders where I had retrieved it from the back of the chair, I sat at the table and looked at the logbook and did not open it again. The radio produced a low static that was neither voice nor music, but sat somewhere between them, a frequency artifact, the sound of signal looking for signal and not finding it. Outside, the fog bell ran its cycle. 6 strokes. A silence that seemed to last precisely as long as the bell took to complete its 6 strokes, mirrored, patient, as though something was listening to the bell the way you listen to a voice, waiting for the pause that means it is your turn to speak. I became aware, slowly, of a smell. Not pine, not salt, something domestic, something warm. The specific smell of paper that has been stored for a long time in a dry place and then opened. There were no books open in the room. The logbook on the table was closed. The bookcase across the room held its warped, salt-stiffened volumes in silence. I sat very still and I breathed the smell in, and my body recognized it entirely before my mind said the word. My mother's journals. The box in Portland with the new tape over the cut tape. The box I had not opened. The smell of it was here, in this room, on this island, with no reason to be here at all, and my jaw had gone tight without my noticing, and the candle flame was perfectly still, and the bell rang and then went silent. There is a particular gravity to a room that has been waiting for something it has not been permitted to say. The smell was gone by morning, not faded, gone. The way a word disappears from a sentence when you look directly at it, completely and without residue, so that by the time I was standing at the kitchen window with my second cup of coffee, I had already begun the process of rationalizing it. Old paper in the logbook, something in the walls, a trick of cold air moving through a space that had absorbed decades of other people's belongings. The mind is extraordinarily efficient at this kind of work. I had watched it happen in other people for 15 years, and I watched it happen in myself now with a detachment that was almost professional, almost comfortable, and entirely false. The logbook was on the table where I had left it. I opened it at the beginning this time, carefully, the way you open something you understand to be fragile. The earliest entries were in a formal hand. Each letter constructed with the deliberateness of someone who had learned penmanship as a moral discipline. The first keeper's name, according to the list on the wall above the stove, had been a man named Silas Ware, appointed 1843. His entries were brief and technical: weather conditions, fuel consumption, lamp maintenance, the occasional notation of a passing vessel. He recorded the weight of the fog, literally, in his own terms, calling heavy fog days of burden, as though the atmosphere were a physical load the island was required to carry. November 14, 1847. Burden again. 3rd week consecutive. The lamp burns. I am burned also. I read that twice. I turned several pages. A later keeper, his handwriting looser, more urgent. Something counted with the bell last night. I do not mean the mechanism, I mean something counted alongside it. Paused when it paused, resumed when it resumed. I stayed at the window until the fog cleared at 4 in the morning and saw nothing but the counting. The counting I heard clearly. I set the logbook down. I looked at the radio on the table, its LED indicator a steady green, connected to nothing but ready to connect. I thought about calling the Society's mainland contact number, which was written on the inside cover of the checklist clipboard. I thought about what I would say. I thought about the particular expression a grief counselor learns to wear. When a client reports something they are afraid sounds irrational. The expression that says, "I am not going to tell you what you heard," and I put the logbook in the drawer of the bookcase and went outside. The morning was the clearest I had seen. The fog had pulled back to a thin line at the horizon, and the island revealed itself in full November light, brown and flat and smaller than I had imagined from the water, perhaps 40 acres of granite ledge and salt-killed grass, the lighthouse at the highest point, the keeper's house below it, the dock at the southern end, and between them a topography of low stone walls whose purpose was no longer legible, borders of something that had ceased to exist. The walls were old enough that they had sunk into the ground in places, their courses loosened by frost and root, and walking the island's perimeter meant stepping over them repeatedly, the granite wet and dark and cold under my hand when I steadied myself. I walked for an hour. At the northern end of the island, furthest from the dock, there was a second structure I had not seen in the fog, a low stone building, its roof partially collapsed, its doorway open to the weather. I stood at the entrance and looked in. The interior held the wreckage of some old practical function. Rusted iron fittings, a section of pipe, a wooden shelf rotted to its component splinters. On the far wall, above the waterline of whatever flooding had stripped the floor to bare stone, someone had carved into the granite 2 words, "She waits." The carving was old. The edges of the letters had rounded over decades of freeze and thaw, soft enough that they caught shadow rather than light, and I had to angle my head to read them at all. I did not know who had carved them or when, and I understood that they probably referred to a ship, or a tide, or some private notation of a keeper's practical life that had nothing to do with what I was already beginning to feel in this building, which was the specific sensation of occupying a space that was interested in me. I left. On the way back to the house, I passed the tower, and I stopped. The tower door was open. I had locked it. I remembered the key, the sequence of incorrect keys before the correct one, the deliberate turning of the lock until I felt the bolt engage. The door was now open by perhaps 8 inches, and through the gap came the smell of the interior, iron, stone, deep cold, and with it a sound I needed several seconds to identify, because it was not a sound that belonged in an iron staircase in a lighthouse on an island in late November. It was a piano, a single repeated phrase, 8 notes, ascending, then the same 8 notes again, and then again, and the sound was distant enough that I could have placed it anywhere, inside the tower, or behind it, or below the water, and it had the quality of something not performed but compelled, the quality of a hand playing not because it chose to, but because it had forgotten how to stop. I knew about the piano stories. I had read about Seguin Island's legend before I came. The keeper's wife, the single repeated tune, the husband's eventual fracture. I had thought of it as a story. I was standing 8 feet from an open door I had locked, listening to 8 ascending notes played on an instrument that did not exist on this island, and the clinical part of my mind said, auditory experience consistent with high stress, sleep deficit, and unprocessed grief, note and continue. And the rest of me said nothing at all, because the rest of me had gone very quiet and very still, the way animals go quiet and still when something larger than them enters the clearing. The notes stopped. The door was still open. I went inside. The staircase was empty. The lantern room was exactly as I had left it, lens intact, fittings secure, the pewter water visible through the glass. I stood at the top and listened until I was certain there was nothing to hear, and then I descended, and I counted 62 steps, and I counted 62 steps again. And I stood at the bottom, understood that the discrepancy of the previous day was not going to resolve itself through counting. I locked the door. I tested the lock. I went back to the house and consulted the logbook for the first time with genuine intent, searching for the name of the keeper who had written about the counting. The entry was undated. The handwriting matched, roughly, with a name from the wall-mounted list. Edward Marsh, keeper from 1921 to 1934. I sat with that for a long time. My name is Clara Marsh. The connection was almost certainly coincidental. Marsh is not an uncommon name. The fact that a keeper named Marsh had served on this island for 13 years and had written about something that counted alongside the bell was not evidence of anything except the long human habit of finding patterns in the available dark. I knew this. I sat with the logbook open to the undated entry, and I knew this with complete professional certainty. And beneath that certainty was something that had no professional category. Something that was simply the awareness of a name on a wall, and a name on a birth certificate, and an island in November fog, and a smell that should not have been here, and a door I had locked that was not locked, accumulated not into meaning but into weight, the way grief accumulates, not as a single event but as a series of ordinary things that the body learns to carry until the day it cannot. The cellar hatch was in the kitchen floor. I had said tomorrow the day before, and today was tomorrow, and I stood over the hatch and looked at the iron ring set into the wood, and I thought about my mother's handwriting, which I had not seen in 11 years, which was in a box in Portland under new tape, and I thought about the logbook entry from the keeper who shared my name, and I thought, you came here for a reason, and the reason was not to inspect cellar joists. I pulled the hatch open. The smell came up immediately, earth and cold stone and something that was almost familiar, something at the edge of what I could name, something that my body recognized a full second before my mind caught up with it and said, old paper, dry and kept. The smell of something stored carefully for a long time in the dark, waiting to be found. I stood at the top of the cellar stairs and breathed it in. The generator ran. The fog bell counted its 6 strokes. The island held itself still under the November sky, and below me the dark of the cellar held its smell. And the smell was the smell of my mother's journals, and I had not opened the box, and I was 700 miles from Portland, and I gripped the hatch frame with both hands, because something in my legs had decided, without asking me, that they were not ready to go down those stairs. Not yet. But closer than yesterday. Whatever was below those stairs had been waiting a great deal longer than I had been on the island, and it was not, I understood then, waiting for just anyone. The cellar stairs were 8 steps. I know because I stood at the top and counted them before I took the first one, and I counted them again on the way down, and the number did not change, and I noticed that I noticed this, and understood what it meant about the state of my attention after 2 days on this island. The cellar was a single room, low-ceilinged, the walls the same island granite as the tower, the floor packed earth that had frozen and thawed so many seasons that it had developed a surface like old leather, cracked and ridged, hardened by decades of cold into something that was not quite stone but had ambitions in that direction. A single bare bulb hung from a cord attached to a ceiling joist, and it worked, which surprised me, and the light it produced was the particular amber of a bulb that has been burning intermittently for many years and is conserving what it has left. There were shelves along 3 walls. The shelves held the material accumulation of 140 years of occupation. Glass jars sealed with wax, their contents gone to amber or brown sediment. Coils of rope stiff with age, 3 hurricane lanterns without their chimneys, a set of logbooks older than the one upstairs, their spines gone to powder, arranged in chronological order by a hand that had cared very much about sequence, and on the lowest shelf of the north wall, set apart from everything else with a deliberateness that was immediately apparent, a wooden box approximately the size of a large dictionary, its lid fitted with a small brass hasp, the hasp unlocked, the wood itself a dark walnut that had been oiled at some point, and had kept the oil against all reason. I stood in front of it for a long time. The smell was strongest here, close to the north wall, close to the box, that dry paper smell, the smell of careful storage, The smell I had been rationalizing since the second night. Standing directly in front of the source, I could not rationalize it. It was precise and specific, and it was the smell of my mother's house in the room where she kept her journals. The third bedroom she had converted to a study when I left for college. A room I had entered perhaps twice in adulthood, and that my body had apparently memorized anyway, stored in the kind of cellular memory that bypasses the mind entirely and surfaces only under conditions of sufficient pressure. My hands were not shaking. I noted this with the same detached precision with which I had been noting everything. The way the body sometimes goes very still and very deliberate when it understands that a thing is about to happen that it will not be able to untake. I opened the box. Inside, wrapped in a cloth that had once been white and was now the color of old ivory, was a journal. Not my mother's journal. I understood that immediately and completely, the way you understand things that the available evidence has been building toward across multiple days. It was older than my mother. The cover was leather. The leather cracked at the spine, the pages dense and cream-colored, and covered in a handwriting I recognized, the same hand as the undated logbook entry upstairs. Edward Marsh, keeper, 1921 to 1934. I carried it upstairs to the kitchen table and sat down with it in the full light of the window, and I opened it at random, the way you open a book when you do not want to commit to beginning at the beginning, when you want to let the book choose what it shows you first. The page I opened to was dated March 1931. She has been at the window again, not every night, every third night or every fourth, with an irregularity that feels deliberate, the way a person spaces out contact to prevent the other person from becoming accustomed to it, to keep them always slightly off balance. I have stopped trying to see her clearly. When I look directly, there is nothing. When I am occupied with something else, when my attention is genuinely elsewhere, I am aware of her at the window the way you are aware of a sound you cannot locate, not through any specific sense, but through the accumulated wrongness of the air in a room where something has changed. I do not think she is malevolent. I think she is incomplete. I have been here 10 years. The island does not give up its keepers easily. I understand this now in a way that I did not understand when I arrived, full of the particular arrogance of a man who had been told he was good at maintaining things. The island does not need maintaining. The island maintains. What it requires is witness, someone to stay when the fog comes in and the bell rings and the light turns, and the water does whatever the water is going to do, regardless of the light or the bell or the keeper or anyone. My wife writes and asks when I am coming home. I write and tell her soon. This is the 10th year I have written the word soon, and meant something different by it each time. I set the journal down. I went to the stove and put wood on it, more than I needed, because the act of feeding a fire has a grammar to it, a physical, deliberate grammar, and I needed something with a grammar just then. My hands found the split logs and stacked them and adjusted the damper, and the routine of it held me for several minutes, and when I was finished, I stood with my back to the heat and looked at the journal on the table. Edward Marsh had served this island from 1921 to 1934. 13 years. He had written about something at the window. He had written about witness. He had written about the word soon hollowing out across a decade of repetition, and I recognized the architecture of that, the word that keeps its shape while losing its content, the way the word fine keeps its shape, the way the word later keeps its shape, the way the phrase "I will call you back" keeps its shape across 11 years of accumulated silence until the person you said it to has died. I opened the journal again, toward the back. November 1933. She showed me the door tonight. Not the cellar door and not the tower door. Another door in the north wall of the cellar, behind the lowest shelf. I have examined that wall 100 times. I have put my hands flat against the granite and felt each course of stone, each seam of mortar. There is no door. There is no seam that suggests a door. And yet she stood in the cellar, and she turned, and she looked at the north wall, and the looking was so directed, so completely purposeful, that I understood she was showing me something I had not yet learned to see. I went to the north wall tonight. I pressed my hands against the stone. The stone was warm. In November, in the cellar, the stone was warm. I read the entry 3 more times. Then I went back to the cellar. I went with the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, a heavy aluminum one, and I went with the logbook under my arm, and I went deliberately and without hesitation. The way you sometimes move toward a thing you are afraid of, precisely because the hesitation has become more costly than the approach. The cellar stairs were 8 steps. The light came on. The room presented itself in its amber light, shelves and jars and rope, and the walnut box open on the lowest shelf where I had left it. I went to the north wall. I put my hands flat against the stone, both palms the way the entry described. The stone was cold. Of course it was cold. It was granite in late November at the base of a structure on an island in the Gulf of Maine, and it was cold the way stone is cold, thoroughly and without variation, and I stood with my palms against it, and I felt nothing except cold and the slight roughness of old mortar at the seams and my own heartbeat, which I was newly and acutely aware of, a wet, determined sound in my ears that seemed very loud in this room. I moved my hands along the wall, at the far left edge of the north face, where the wall met the corner and the bottom shelf sat low enough that I had to crouch. My left hand found a seam that ran vertically, where the horizontal courses said there should be no vertical seam. Perhaps 4 feet tall and perhaps 2 feet wide, the dimensions of a passage built for someone willing to move through it sideways, stooped, without comfort or convenience, built for someone who needed to move through it rather than someone who wanted to. The stone in the seam moved, not much, a fraction of an inch, an exhalation's worth, a give that should not have existed in solid granite. But it gave, and when it gave, the smell came through. Not the old paper smell, not the cold stone smell, but something new, something I had not encountered anywhere else on this island, something that arrived through that fraction of an inch gap and moved past my face before I could do anything with it, except register it with the whole of my body at once. Soil after rain, rich and deep and generative, and beneath it, underneath so faint it could have been memory rather than sensation, the particular smell of a candle that has just been extinguished, as though someone on the other side of a wall I had not known existed until 40 seconds ago had just blown out a light. I took my hands off the stone. The warmth from the entry, Edward Marsh's warmth, November 1933, was not there. The stone was cold. The gap was narrow and dark, and the smell had already dissipated, absorbed back into the cellar air, leaving only the faint ghost of it that I would spend the next several hours telling myself had been imagination. My jaw ached. I had been clenching it, I realized, since I came down the stairs. I went back up to the kitchen. I sat at the table. Outside, the fog had returned entirely, and the fog bell began its cycle, and I counted the strokes without meaning to. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And in the silence that followed, I heard, once, from somewhere in the depth of the island, or the depth of the house, or the depth of the 11 years I had not called my mother, a 7th stroke, a single additional toll, quiet, unhurried, entirely certain of itself. I looked at the radio, I looked at the journal, I looked at the cellar hatch in the kitchen floor, which I had closed and which was closed. I thought about my mother's handwriting, which I had not seen in 11 years, and I thought about the box in Portland, and I thought about a woman at a window who showed a keeper named Marsh something in the north wall of a cellar, and I thought, whatever this island is doing, it is not doing it to a stranger. It is doing it to someone it has been waiting for. The 7th stroke did not repeat, but I understood, sitting there in the kitchen with my hands flat on the table the way I had pressed them against the stone. that it had not needed to. I did not sleep in the house that night, not because I was afraid, or not only because of that. The distinction mattered to me in a way I recognized as characteristic, the counselor's reflex to be precise about interior states even when precision serves mostly to delay the larger acknowledgement. I did not sleep because somewhere around 2 in the morning I became aware that I was lying on the couch in the main room, listening to the fog bell with the specific quality of attention you give to something you are waiting to deviate from its pattern. And that waiting was costing me more than moving wood, and so I got up and put on every layer I had brought and went outside. The cold was immediate and total. Not the cold of the house, which was the cold of a space imperfectly heated, the cold of gaps and old insulation and a stove that needed tending every few hours. This was the cold of open water in late November. The cold of a wind that had come a very long distance without meeting anything and arrived at this island, carrying the accumulated temperature of the open Atlantic. It hit my face and the back of my hands and found the gap at my collar, and I stood in it for a moment with my eyes closed, just absorbing it, the way you hold your face under cold water when a headache will not resolve any other way. The fog bell was silent. The beam was turning. Every 8 seconds the light swept across the fog above me, not penetrating it, only illuminating its surface from below, and the effect was of something immense and pale rotating overhead, patient and unhurried, a ceiling that was also a movement. I watched it for a while. The island around me was entirely dark except for the beam's cycle, and in the intervals between sweeps, the dark was complete enough that I lost the edges of things, where the grass ended and the path began, where the path curved toward the tower. Between sweeps I navigated by memory. I walked to the northern end of the island, to the stone building with the collapsed roof, to the doorway that faced west, to the 2 words carved into the far wall, which I could not read in this darkness, but knew were there the way you know the furniture of a room you have slept in long enough, not by sight, but by the spatial memory of the body, which keeps its own maps. I stood in the doorway of the building and looked in. I will not say that I saw anything. I want to be precise here, because precision is the only thing I have to offer, and because imprecision would be a particular kind of dishonesty, the kind that dresses experience up until it is unrecognizable, until it becomes a story rather than a thing that happened. What I will say is that the darkness inside the building was not uniform, that there was a quality of difference in the far corner, near the carved words, that was not explained by the beam's 8-second sweep, and was not explained by my eyes adjusting to the dark, and that when I focused on it directly it resolved to nothing, and when I let my gaze drift to the middle distance it returned, and that it had. This is the word I keep coming back to, the word I have tested against every available alternative and found to be the most accurate. It had a weight to it, the weight of a presence that was also a patience. I stood in the doorway for a long time. My feet went from cold to numb, and I shifted my weight without stepping forward. And at some point I became aware that I was not breathing in the shallow, careful way of someone watching something, but in the deep, involuntary way of someone who has stopped monitoring their own breath because their attention is entirely elsewhere. And that elsewhere was the corner of that building, and what I was feeling was not fear. It took me a long time to name it correctly. What I was feeling was recognition. The specific interior event of encountering something that your body understands before your mind has assembled the language for it. The way you sometimes know before the phone rings that the call will matter. The way you knew, if you were me, standing at the window of your graduate school apartment 11 years ago, that the voicemail you were about to not return was one you should return. And you did not return it anyway, and you had been carrying the weight of that specific choice through every subsequent day of your adult life. And here on this island in the dark, that weight had not a face, not a shape, a quality of regard, a directedness, Something in that corner was oriented toward me with the focused, unhurried attention of something that had been waiting for a specific person and had identified at last that the specific person had arrived. I stepped back from the doorway. I went back to the house. In the kitchen, I lit the candle and sat at the table with Edward Marsh's journal, and I opened it at the beginning this time, which I had been avoiding, and I read from the first entry in order, steadily, the way you read something you understand you are going to need to have read. His arrival on the island in the spring of 1921 was recorded in the same brief, practical register as the earliest keeper in the older logbook. Weather, fuel, the lamp's condition, a notation that the keeper's house needed work on its north-facing windows. By the second month, the entries had lengthened. By autumn of that first year, they had changed in character entirely. October 1921. I have been trying to identify what is different about the island after dark. During the day, it is simply an island, difficult, cold, requiring, but legible, and after dark it becomes something with intention. This is not a rational observation, and I record it only because this journal is not for anyone but me. The intention is not hostile. It is more like the intention of a place that has been a certain way for a very long time and intends to continue being that way, and regards the keeper as incidental to that continuation. I am not unsettled by this. I am, if I am honest, relieved. I have spent 40 years trying to be necessary to things. It is restful to be incidental. The following spring, 1922, she appeared for the first time on the anniversary of the storm of 1889. I know the date because it is recorded in the older logbooks. As the night 3 vessels went down on the north ledge, and the previous keeper pulled 7 men from the water single-handed and lost his assistant in the process. The assistant was a young woman. This surprises me, but the record is clear. A woman hired locally because no man had applied for the position at the wage offered, named Margaret. No surname recorded. The entry says only, "Lost Margaret to the sea tonight," and is written in a hand so controlled it is clearly the hand of a man concentrating very hard on the act of writing in order to avoid the act of feeling. I stopped reading. I set the journal flat on the table with both hands on it, not gripping it, just resting, the way you rest your hands on a surface when you need the surface to be solid. Margaret. No surname. Lost to the sea in 1889. The stone building at the north end of the island, 2 words carved into the wall. She waits. The piano music from the tower. Not the Seguin Island legend of the wife and the single repeated tune, but something older, something this island had accumulated in its own particular darkness. And the door in the north wall of the cellar, the door that was not a door, the warm stone in November that Edward Marsh had pressed his hands against and recorded with the calm precision of a man who had been on the island long enough to stop being surprised by it. She had been the assistant. She had not come inside when the storm took her. She had gone to the water when the vessels went down, because the keeper needed her, because there were 7 men in the water and 1 person pulling them out alone, and she had gone, and she had not come back, and the island had kept her, the way the island keeps everything that it considers its own. Not malevolently, the way Edward Marsh had written, not malevolently, but completely, with the thoroughness of something that does not recognize the distinction between holding and trapping. And she had been here every November since, and she had shown herself to keepers. To Edward Marsh, who shared a name with me, and who had served 13 years, and had written the word soon across a decade of letters to his wife, and had stayed and stayed and stayed. My mother's name had been Ellen. My mother had kept her journals every day for 40 years, and had called me 11 years ago and said she needed to tell me something, and I had said I would call her back, and the thing she had needed to tell me. I did not know what it was. I had constructed 100 versions of it across 11 years, each version slightly more unbearable than the last. each one shaped by the specific guilt of a daughter who understood grief professionally and had made herself an expert in it precisely because she could not bear to feel her own. The box was in Portland. The journals were in the box. The island was here, and Margaret was here, and whatever Margaret had been trying to show the keepers who came after her, through windows, through stone walls, through the smell of something that should not have been present, through a seventh stroke of a bell that rang 6. Whatever she had been trying to show them was the same thing. I understood now, in the particular clarity that comes at 3 in the morning when you have run out of rationalizations, and the candle is burning low, and the beam is turning overhead, and there is nowhere left to retreat to. She was showing them the door. She was showing them that the door was there, that the passage existed, that the thing on the other side of the wall was accessible if you were willing to go through in the dark, stooped and sideways and without comfort, and that what was required was not courage exactly, but its quieter cousin, the willingness to stop pretending that the wall was solid. My hands were on the journal. The candle guttered in a draft from somewhere. I sat in the near dark with the journal under my palms, and I felt, for the first time since I had arrived on this island, the specific interior shift that I had watched happen in clients across 15 years of practice. That moment when the body stops spending energy on the maintenance of a position it can no longer hold. When the exhaustion of not knowing gives way to the deeper exhaustion of knowing. When the grief that has been living in the body as tension and insomnia and professional precision and new tape over cut tape finally stops pretending to be anything other than what it is. I was not fine. I had not been fine for 11 years. I had not been fine since the afternoon I stood at my apartment window with a voicemail notification on my phone and chose to be too busy, chose the comfortable weight of not knowing over the effort of picking up the phone, and had kept choosing it every day since. Right up until the day my aunt called and said the words that meant the choice was no longer available. The candle went out. I sat in the dark. The fog bell rang. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and in the silence that followed, I did not wait for the 7th stroke, because I understood now that the 7th stroke was not a sound from outside the house or outside my body, but from inside it, the sound of something that had been ringing in me for 11 years, and that I had been insisting with professional thoroughness was just the house settling. Outside, somewhere between the house and the northern building, in the fog and the dark and the cold, the beam swept overhead every 8 seconds and illuminated nothing and everything, patient and exact and entirely without judgment. The island had been waiting for someone who already knew what it was like to have something on the other side of a wall, and to have chosen, for too long, not to go through. 3 days passed before I went back to the cellar. Not because I had decided to wait, because the island made waiting feel purposeful in a way I had not anticipated. Purposeful the way convalescence is purposeful, the way the body slows itself after a fever breaks, not from weakness, but from the intelligence of a system that understands recovery, has its own pace, and will not be hurried by the mind's impatience. I woke each morning and did the work on the checklist. I oiled things and measured things and recorded things and walked the perimeter. And I let the island be what it was in the daylight hours, which was simply an island, cold and flat and requiring. And I let what I had understood in the kitchen at 3 in the morning exist alongside the daily work without forcing them into the same sentence. On the 4th morning, Roy came back. I heard the ferry before I saw it. The low diesel thrum arriving through the fog about 40 minutes before the boat itself materialized at the end of the dock, emerging from the gray in the slow way of things that have been there all along and are simply becoming visible. He brought fuel for the generator in 2 red plastic canisters, a cardboard box of additional supplies from the society, more canned goods, a new propane canister for the kitchen range, a bag of coffee, and a sealed envelope with my name on it in a handwriting I did not recognize. Roy did not come up to the house. He set the canisters and the box on the dock, held the boat steady with one hand on a cleat, and looked at me with the expression of a man who has ferried people to and from isolated places for long enough that he no longer needs to ask how they are doing to know. He said, "You found the journal." It was not a question. I said yes. He said, "People usually find it in the first week, or they do not find it at all." I asked him how many people had found it. He looked at the water for a moment, the way people look at things that are not the question when they are deciding how much of the answer to give. Then he said, "3 that I know of, before you." I asked what happened to them. He said, 2 left early. 1 stayed the winter. I asked about the one who stayed. He said her name was Ruth, and that she had been a retired school teacher from Rockland, and that she had come to the island in the November after her husband of 40 years had died, and that she had stayed through March, and that when he had ferried her back to the mainland in the spring she had been. He paused here, searching for the word with the visible effort of a man who chooses his words slowly and means the ones he chooses. "Settled," he said. She had been settled in a way she had not been when she arrived. I asked if he knew what she had found in the cellar. He said, "I know what she told me, which was that there is a passage in the north wall, and that the passage goes somewhere, and that what is at the end of it is not dangerous, but it requires something from you. She said it requires you to bring something with you that you have been carrying a long time, and to leave it there." I held the sealed envelope in both hands. Roy looked at it and said, "That came from Ruth." He cast off before I could say anything else, and the ferry reversed from the dock and thickened into the fog and then was gone, and I stood on the dock with the envelope and the sound of the diesel fading until there was only the bell and the water and the cold. Inside, at the kitchen table, I opened the envelope. The letter was 3 pages. Handwritten on the kind of lined paper sold in drugstores everywhere, in the handwriting of a woman who had written a great deal in her life and had strong feelings about the proper formation of certain letters. The date at the top was November, 4 years prior. She wrote, "I do not know who will read this. Roy tells me the society gives the winter position to people who need it rather than people who simply want it, and that he has been the one for 30 years to make that determination based on what he sees in the people at the dock. I trust his judgment. If you are reading this, he trusted his about you. I want to tell you what I found, because I wish someone had told me, not because it would have made it easier. I do not think it can be made easier, but because knowing the shape of a thing before you encounter it lets you meet it as yourself rather than as someone in the process of being undone. There is a woman in the north wall of the cellar. I do not mean this as a metaphor, and I do not mean it in any mystical register that I find comfortable to inhabit, because I am a practical person, and mysticism has always seemed to me like a way of making distance between yourself and the thing you are actually experiencing. I mean that there is a passage in the north wall of the cellar, and that at the end of the passage there is a space, and that in the space I encountered something I can only describe as a presence that was also a person. Her name was Margaret. I do not know this because she told me. I know it because after 30 years of teaching 7th grade, I am familiar with the experience of being in a room with someone who has a great deal to communicate and no conventional means of communicating it, and who has therefore made the reasonable decision to communicate through atmosphere and attention and the quality of silence that exists just before understanding arrives. She did not frighten me. I want to say that clearly. She was not frightening. She was what grief looks like when it has been in a place long enough to become part of the place's structure. Not heavy, not bitter, simply present. The way certain kinds of love are simply present, even when the person who generated the love is no longer there to generate it. What I brought with me into the passage was the last letter my husband wrote me. He wrote it in the hospital 3 weeks before the end. I had been carrying it in my coat pocket for 4 months because I could not read it and I could not put it down. I brought it with me into the passage and I read it there, in the dark, by flashlight on my knees on the cold earth. And I want to tell you that I do not have the language for what happened next. And I am a woman who has spent 60 years acquiring language for things, so this is a significant admission. I will only say this. The letter, when I came back out of the passage, was still in my hands, but the weight of it was different. The weight that had been in my coat pocket for 4 months, in my chest, in my sleep, in every room I entered and exited and tried to feel at home in, was different. Not gone, different. Grief does not leave, but it changes form, the way water changes form, and in one form it is a thing you carry, and in another form it is a thing that carries you. And the passage is where the change happens if you bring the right thing with you and are willing to stay in the dark long enough for it to work. I do not know what the right thing is for you. I suspect you already know. The letter was signed Ruth Calloway, Rockland, Maine. Below the signature, a postscript. The 7th stroke of the bell is hers. She rings it when she knows someone is listening. In 30 years, Roy tells me, she has rung it for 4 people. You are the 4th. I folded the letter and set it on the table. The fog bell ran its cycle. 6 strokes. Precisely. And then the silence that followed. And I sat in the silence and I thought about a box in Portland with new tape over cut tape. And I thought about a flat-rate priority mailbox that my aunt had sent because there was no one else to send it to. Because there was no one else who should have it. Because regardless of 11 years of silence, the journals belonged to me. And the thing my mother had needed to tell me was inside them. And I had been carrying the not knowing of that thing the way Ruth Calloway had carried her husband's letter. In every room, in every hour, in every conversation I had ever had with a grieving person in which I had maintained the precise professional distance of someone who understood grief from the outside and was managing, with considerable effort, to keep it there. The passage in the north wall of the cellar was 4 feet tall and 2 feet wide. It required you to go through sideways and stooped and without comfort. I understood now what I needed to bring into it. I went to my bag in the corner of the main room, the bag I had packed in Portland with the focused efficiency of someone who did not want to leave themselves time to think. And I took out my phone, and I opened the voicemail application, and I found the message saved in its own folder, labeled with my mother's name and the date from 11 years ago, and I pressed play for the first time. My mother's voice filled the kitchen. She said, "Clara, it is Mom. I need to talk to you about something. It is nothing bad. I want you to know that first. It is not bad news. There are things I wrote down, things I put in the journals over the years, that I would want you to have the chance to hear from me rather than just find. I know we have not talked as much as I would have liked. I know that is not only on you. I just want to say some things while I have the time to say them the right way. Call me when you can. I love you. I am proud of you. I should say that more. Call me." The message ended. I sat in the kitchen with my phone in both hands, and I listened to the silence where her voice had been, and outside the fog bell ran its cycle, and in the silence, after the 6th stroke, there was the 7th, quiet and unhurried and entirely certain, and it rang through the kitchen and through my chest, and through 11 years of accumulated silence, and I did not try to rationalize it. I let it ring. I sat at the table for a long time after that, not thinking and not planning, just sitting in the way you sit when you have put something down that you have been carrying for so long that putting it down is itself a physical event, something that requires adjustment, something the body needs a moment to absorb before it reorganizes itself around the new weight of things. Then I got up. I opened the cellar hatch. I counted 8 steps on the way down, and the amber light came on, and the room arranged itself around me, shelves and jars, and the walnut box on the lowest shelf with its lid still open. And I went to the north wall, and I crouched, and I found the vertical seam. And this time when I pressed my hands flat against the stone, it did not feel cold. It felt like the temperature of a room where someone has been sitting for a long time, reading or writing or simply waiting, with the patience of something that has stopped measuring time in units that mean anything to the living. I pressed, and the stone gave. The passage opened inward into dark, and the smell that came through was not soil and not rain and not extinguished candles, but something I had no name for, something that was warm and close and human in the way that a room is human after the person who lived in it has gone, the way warmth persists in a space after the source of it has moved on, not supernatural, not uncanny, simply the evidence of a long and faithful occupation. I pressed my phone against my chest. I went in. Whatever had been waiting at the end of a passage had not been waiting for a keeper. It had been waiting for a daughter. The passage was longer than its entrance suggested. I had imagined something brief, a gap between walls, an architectural accident, the kind of space that exists in old structures because the people who built them were solving problems of weight and drainage and did not concern themselves with what future occupants might make of the gaps between their solutions. I had imagined 3 feet of dark and then a wall. What I moved through instead was a tunnel deliberately shaped, its floor packed earth worn smooth by passage, its walls granite fitted without mortar in the old dry stack method. Each stone selected for how it bore against the others, held in place by weight and intention rather than adhesive. Someone had built this. Someone had built it carefully and had built it to be used. I moved through it sideways, my right shoulder leading, the flashlight in my left hand, throwing a beam that barely preceded me in the narrow space. The ceiling was close enough that I felt it without touching it. The particular awareness of a surface just above your head that changes the quality of your breathing, makes each breath a slightly more conscious act. The smell intensified as I moved deeper, that warm, inhabited smell, that evidence of a long and patient occupation, and beneath it, so faint it might have been the smell of the stone itself, something almost sweet, almost floral, almost the kind of smell that belongs to a kitchen in summer rather than a tunnel in November. I counted my steps. 14, 15, 16. At 22 steps the passage opened, not dramatically, not into a cavern or a chamber with high ceilings and geological grandeur. It opened into a room approximately the size of a large closet, its ceiling perhaps 5 feet high, its walls the same dry stacked granite as the passage, its floor the same worn earth. There was nothing in it that should not have been there, and nothing that explained the warmth which was real and consistent, and had no source I could identify. No vent, no pipe, no accumulated heat from the structure above. The room was simply warm the way a room is warm when it has been occupied for a very long time by something that generates warmth. I stood in the entrance of the room and held the flashlight steady. In the far corner, at floor level, there was a lantern. An old hurricane lantern, its chimney intact, its reservoir empty of oil, its wick dry and dark. Beside the lantern, folded with a precision that spoke of repetition, the same fold performed many times until the fold itself became a kind of ritual. A piece of cloth, linen perhaps, the color of old ivory. And beside the cloth, pressed flat against the stone of the corner, a single stone that was different from the others, smoother, darker, water-rounded, the kind of stone carried up from the shoreline rather than quarried from the island's bones. A kept stone. Someone had carried it here and kept it. I went in. My knees took me to the floor before I had decided to kneel, the way the body sometimes enacts a posture that the mind has not yet formally approved. A genuflection, a surrender, something between the two. The earth under my knees was cold through my jeans, and the cold was precise and grounding. And I let it be both of those things. I put the flashlight on the floor beside me, aimed at the corner, and I took out my phone. I played my mother's voicemail again. In the open kitchen, it had filled the room. In this room, in this passage under the cellar of a lighthouse keeper's house on an island in the Gulf of Maine in late November, it filled something else. Something that had no architectural name. Something that was the interior equivalent of a room. The space inside a person where the things they have not allowed themselves to hear are stored until the conditions are right for hearing them. Clara, it is Mom. My mother's voice was lower than I remembered it. I had been remembering a version of it that was younger. The voice from my childhood, from the kitchen garden, and the fig trees and the burlap in October. And the voice on the recording was the voice of a woman in her late 60s. A woman whose vocal cords had been doing the daily work of a life for 67 years, and the texture of it was different from the texture I had been carrying in my memory. Richer and slower and more tired. I should say that more. Call me. The recording ended. I sat in the silence after it, with both hands in my lap and my eyes on the water-rounded stone in the corner, and the silence had a quality I had not encountered outside of certain specific moments in my professional life. Those moments in a session when a client arrives, finally, at the thing they came to say, and the room holds it, and you hold it with them, and the holding is the work, the whole of the work. Nothing is required beyond the willingness to be present in the same space as the thing that has been carried so long and so heavily, and is now, at last, in the open air. I became aware of her gradually, not as a visual event, not as a sound, as a change in the quality of the room's attention. The same change I had registered in the stone building at the north end of the island. The weight of a directedness, of something in the space that was oriented toward me, with the focused patience of something that had been waiting for a specific person and had now confirmed the specific person's arrival. But here, in this room, it was closer. Not threatening in its closeness. Closer the way another person is close when they have decided that the distance between you is no longer necessary. When the thing that required distance has been acknowledged and does not require distance anymore. I understood what she was. Not a haunting in the register I would have used before this island. Not a remnant or a residue. Something more purposeful than that, more structured. A grief that had outlasted the body that generated it and had organized itself across 130 years around a function. She had died in service. She had gone into the water because the storm required it and the men in the water required it, and the keeper alone was not enough, and the island had kept her, and what the island had kept was not her fear or her suffering, but her capacity, the specific human capacity she had exercised in the last hours of her life, which was the capacity to remain present in the dark with someone who needed witnessing. That was what she had been doing for every keeper since. Edward Marsh, who had stayed 13 years and written the word soon until it was hollow, and whom she had shown the passage, and who had gone through it and come back changed in ways his journal recorded only obliquely. In the difference between his early entries and his later ones, the early precision giving way to a later warmth, a later willingness to sit with what he could not resolve. For Ruth Calloway, who had carried her husband's letter in her coat pocket for 4 months, and had read it here, on her knees on the cold earth, and had come back up the stairs settled. For whoever had come before them, whoever had been the second and the third and the others the island had called in seasons before Roy was the one doing the ferrying. And for me, I took my phone and I opened the photograph application, and I found the picture I had taken 2 months before my mother died, at my aunt's insistence, at a family gathering I had attended with the stiff goodwill of someone fulfilling an obligation. My mother in the photograph was sitting in a chair in my aunt's backyard, in the August light, a cup of tea going cold in her hands the way tea always went cold in her hands, because she forgot it when she was talking, and she was always talking. She was looking at something outside the frame. She was smiling at something I had not seen. I had looked at this photograph perhaps twice since I took it. I looked at it now. I looked at the way her hands held the cup, loose and familiar, the way you hold something you have held 10,000 times. I looked at the gray in her hair that had not been there the last time I had seen her in person, years before the photograph, and I understood with a clarity that was purely physical, not cognitive, not professional, not the understanding of a grief counselor assembling the components of a loss into their proper clinical categories. I understood with my body that she had gone gray without me, that she had gotten older without me, that there was a version of my mother's life that I had not been present for, years of it, the fig trees in October and the journals and the kitchen garden and the slower voice on the recording, and I had not been there, and she had not been angry. The recording made clear she had not been angry. She had been, the word she used was proud. She had said, "I am proud of you," which was the specific word of someone who has been watching from a distance and has chosen love over the account of grievances, who has chosen to spend whatever time is available on what she wanted to say rather than what she had a right to say. The warmth in the room shifted, not in temperature, in quality. The way the atmosphere in a room shifts when someone in it moves, even when you cannot see them move, when you are aware of the change of position through some sense that has no clinical name. I pressed the photograph against my chest, the way I had pressed the phone against my chest at the top of the cellar stairs, and I closed my eyes, and I stayed in the dark, in the warm, in the patient company of something that had been doing this work for 130 years, and had not grown tired of it, had not grown cold or bitter or indifferent, had maintained across that entire span of time the same quality of attention that it had exercised on the night of the storm when it had gone into the water, because someone needed it to. I do not know how long I was in that room. Long enough that when I became aware of my body again, my knees had gone from cold to numb, and the warmth of the room had settled into my hands, and the flashlight beam on the floor beside me had taken on the amber quality of a light that has been burning for a while in a small space, and the water-rounded stone in the corner was exactly where it had been, and the folded cloth and the empty lantern. I picked up the lantern. I did not know why until I was holding it. The body again, acting before the mind had drafted its approval, and when I held it I understood that this was what she had been waiting to give. Not the room, not the passage, not the warmth, which was her own and would remain. The lantern, empty of oil, unable to burn in any conventional sense, but kept here with the folded cloth and the carried stone, as though it were the most important object in the room, which I understood now it was. A keeper's lantern, carried out into the storm on the night in 1889 when the 3 vessels went down on the North Ledge. I held it in both hands, and I felt its weight, which was the weight of cast iron and glass, and also the weight of something that had been held by someone who had died carrying it, and I sat with both weights simultaneously without trying to separate them, the way Ruth Calloway's letter had been both paper, and something paper is insufficient to describe. I said aloud in that room for the first time in 11 years, "I'm sorry, Mom." I said it the way you say things in empty rooms that are not empty, carefully and without performance, with the full weight of what the words were required to carry, which was 11 years of chosen silence and 1 unreturned voicemail and a box with new tape over cut tape, and the version of her life I had not been present for, and the version of mine she had not been present for, and every session I had sat through with a grieving client while keeping my own grief at its professional distance. All of it, all at once, set into the warm air of a room under the earth of an island in November. The warmth held. It did not answer. It was not my mother. I want to be precise about this, to resist the version of this experience that would be easier and would also be inaccurate. It was not my mother. My mother was in the journals in the box in Portland, and in the voicemail on my phone, and in the way tea goes cold in the hands of someone who forgets it when they are talking, and in the gray she had grown without me, and in the word proud used by someone who chose love over the account of grievances. What was in this room was something older and more general, and also somehow more specific to me than I have the language to accurately describe. What was in this room was what it felt like to be witnessed by something that had chosen, across 130 years and every dark November on this island, to stay. I held the lantern. I breathed in the warm air. And outside, 7 fathoms above me, through earth and stone and the joists of the keeper's house and the November sky, the fog bell ran its cycle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And in the silence after the 6th stroke, the 7th came, and it came differently than it had before, not with the quality of something signaling to be heard, but with the quality of something that has been heard and knows it, quiet and complete, the sound of a bell that has finally rung for the right reason. I stayed in that room until the lantern in my hands felt warm, and then I carried it out. I came up out of the cellar at 4:15 in the afternoon. I know the time because the clock on my phone showed it when I set the lantern on the kitchen table. And I stood looking at the numbers for a moment with the mild bewilderment of someone who has lost track of time in the way that is not disorientation but its opposite. The complete absorption in a present moment so total that the scaffolding of hours had simply become unnecessary and had quietly removed itself. Outside the kitchen window, the light was already going, the November sky compressing its brief daylight into a thin orange seam at the horizon before surrendering it entirely. And the fog was back, and the beam was beginning its 8-second cycle overhead, and everything on the island was behaving exactly as it had behaved every other evening since my arrival. Everything except the quality of the air in the kitchen, which was different, not warmer, not colder. Different the way a room is different after a window has been open. Not from any remaining draft, but from the fact that something that had been inside has been exchanged for something that had been outside, and the room is recalibrated by the exchange. And you feel the recalibration in your lungs before you have the language for it. I filled the kettle and put it on the range. I sat at the table with the lantern in front of me, and I looked at it with the full attention I had been unable to give it underground, where everything had been too large and too close for that kind of looking. In the kitchen light, it was simply an object, cast iron base, cylindrical glass chimney intact despite a century and a third of existence on an island exposed to Atlantic weather, the wick holder empty, the reservoir dry. The iron was pitted in places and smooth in others, the smoothness concentrated on the handle, and the base in the specific pattern of a thing that has been held and carried repeatedly by the same hand or hands over a long period of time. I thought about the hand that had last carried it through an actual storm. I thought about 1889, and a November not unlike this one, and 3 vessels on the North Ledge, and someone who had gone toward the water when going toward the water was what the moment required. The kettle boiled. I made tea and forgot it immediately the way my mother forgot tea, and sat with both hands around the mug without drinking. And this made me smile in a way that surprised me, the involuntary, uncomplicated kind of smile that belongs to recognition rather than happiness, to the specific warmth of understanding that a gesture you thought was only yours has a longer history than you knew. I opened my mother's voicemail one more time. I listened to the whole of it without stopping it, and without looking away from the lantern on the table. And when it ended, I sat in the silence after her voice, and I did not try to fill the silence, which had been my primary strategy for 11 years, and which had never once worked. I let it be silence, and the silence was not empty. It was the silence of a room where someone has just finished speaking, and what they have said is still in the air, still arriving, still doing the slow work of being fully heard. When I was ready, I opened the box. I had not brought the box from Portland. The box was in Portland on the kitchen table, under new tape over cut tape. What I mean is that I opened it in the sense that matters, which is the interior sense. That I stopped spending energy on the maintenance of its closure, stopped applying the daily renewed effort of not opening, and let the box be what it was, which was my mother's words in my possession, available to me when I was ready to receive them. And what the room under the cellar had done was make me ready. I called my aunt in Gloucester. It was the first time I had called her since the brief, functional calls immediately following my mother's death. The arrangements, the paperwork, the flat-rate priority box. She answered on the second ring with the careful neutrality of someone who has been waiting for a call they were not certain would come. And I said, "I want to open the journals when I get back, and I do not want to do it alone." And she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I will be there." And the brevity of it was its own kind of answer. The answer of someone who has been holding a door open for a very long time, and is simply relieved that you have finally walked through it. We talked for 40 minutes. Not about the journals, not about the box, not about the 11 years or the voicemail or any of the things that would need their own conversations in their own time. We talked about my mother, about the fig trees and the way she forgot tea, and the third bedroom that smelled of paper, and the specific cadence of her laugh, which was louder than you expected from a woman her size, and which arrived without warning in the middle of sentences she found funny before she had finished them. My aunt had stories I had never heard from the years before I was born and from the years I had been absent, and I listened to them in the kitchen of the keeper's house on the island with the lantern in front of me and the tea going cold in my hands, and the listening felt like drinking something after a very long thirst, not desperate, not urgent, but deep and continuous and necessary. After I hung up, I sat for a long time. The fog bell cycled, the beam turned. The generator held its steady note outside in its small building. The sound of it so constant over the past days that it had become part of the island's silence rather than an interruption of it, the way tinnitus becomes part of a person's silence, or the way a river becomes part of the silence of the town it runs through. I picked up the lantern and carried it to the main room and set it on the bookcase, on the shelf that held the warped Thoreau and the coverless thrillers, and the accumulated reading of every previous occupant. I set it at the end of the shelf where it was visible from the table and from the couch and from the doorway, and I stood back and looked at where I had put it, and it looked right there in the way that certain objects look right in certain places. Not decorative, not displayed, but present, occupying its location with the unself-conscious permanence of something that belongs. Then I opened Edward Marsh's journal to the last entry. March 1934. I am leaving at the end of this week. The society has found a younger keeper, which is correct. The work requires someone whose knees have not yet made their opinions known on the subject of iron staircases. I have written a letter to my wife, and in the letter I have used the word soon, and for the first time in 13 years, I mean it in the way I meant it at the beginning, in the plain and literal way. Soon meaning a small number of days rather than an unspecified continuation of absence. I do not know how to write about what this island has given me. I have tried several times in these pages, and each attempt has ended with the ink drying on a sentence I could not complete. Because the thing I am trying to describe exists in the register of the body rather than the register of language, and translation between those registers is imperfect at best. I will say only this. I arrived here believing that I was good at maintaining things. I leave understanding the difference between maintenance and witness. Maintenance is what you do to prevent deterioration. Witness is what you offer when deterioration is not the point. When the thing you are present for does not need to be prevented from changing, but only needs someone to remain in the room while it does. She taught me that. Or the island did, through her. I am not certain the distinction matters. I have left the journal in the cellar in the box my grandfather made, because it belongs to the island more than it belongs to me, and because the next keeper who finds it may need it, or the one after that, or the one after that. Whoever you are, go through the passage. Bring the thing you have been carrying. Stay in the dark long enough. The lantern is hers. It always was. Leave it for the one who comes after you. I closed the journal. I looked at the lantern on the bookcase. I understood, reading Marsh's final entry, that the lantern was not mine to keep, not in the sense of taking it with me when I left in the spring, not in the sense of placing it in the apartment in Portland among my own objects, my own accumulated life. It was the islands, which meant it was Margaret's, which meant it was the passages, which meant it was for whoever came next. Whoever Roy looked at on a dock some future November and saw what he had seen in me, in Ruth Calloway and Edward Marsh, and whoever had been second and third, the ones whose names I did not know, and whose stories had not been written down, but whose hands had worn the handle smooth. I would leave it on the bookcase. I would leave the journal in the cellar, back in the walnut box with the brass hasp, back on the lowest shelf of the north wall, where it had been waiting in its careful darkness for exactly as long as it had needed to wait. I would leave Ruth Calloway's letter on the table, with the radio in its envelope, with a note added in my own hand at the bottom of the third page. She is not frightening, and she is not alone, and what she needs from you is the same thing she needed from me, which you already know, because Roy does not bring people here who do not already know it, even when they think they do not. And I would leave one more thing. I went back to the kitchen, and I found the pad of paper the society had left beside the checklist clipboard, and I wrote a letter of my own, not to tonight's caretaker, not to Ruth Calloway, not to Edward Marsh or the society or Roy, to my mother. 7 pages, written without stopping. In the kitchen of the keeper's house on the island, with the lantern visible through the doorway, and the tea-stone cold in the mug, and the fog bell cycling outside, and the beam turning overhead. And in the letter I wrote everything I had been keeping in the space where the letter should have gone for 11 years, the graduate school window, and the voicemail notification, and the choosing not to call, and every subsequent day of that choice, and also the fig trees and the kitchen garden and the summer smell of it, and the specific laugh that arrived before the sentence it belonged to had finished, and the gray she had grown without me, and the word proud said by someone who chose love over the account of grievances, and the tea going cold in both our hands. 7 pages. I folded the letter and did not seal it and carried it to the main room and placed it under the lantern on the bookcase, not inside the lantern, not in the passage, not anywhere significant or ritualized, simply under the lantern on the shelf, held there by the weight of the iron, present and unsealed and available to the air of the room. Outside, the fog bell ran its cycle, 6 strokes. The silence after the 6th was simply silence, wide and clean and full of nothing that needed to be added to it. The silence of a room that has received what it was waiting for, and is now simply a room, simply itself, doing the quiet work of being a space where a person can breathe without the breath costing something. I ate dinner, real dinner, not soup from a can, but rice and canned beans cooked together on the range with the last of a packet of spices I had found in the back of the pantry, eaten at the kitchen table with the checklist open beside me, annotating the items I had completed and the items remaining. The food was ordinary and warm, and I tasted it fully, which I had not been doing since my arrival. The meals of the previous days had been fuel rather than food, consumed with the inattention of someone whose attention was entirely elsewhere. I washed the bowl. I added wood to the stove. I lay down on the couch with the wool blanket across me, and I looked at the ceiling and I thought about nothing specific, which was itself specific. The particular quality of a mind that has put something down and not yet picked up the next thing, the brief open space between one weight and whatever comes after it. I slept before the beam completed its next cycle. I slept without counting anything. In the morning, the letter was still under the lantern, and the lantern was still warm, and outside the island was perfectly quiet, and the fog had lifted entirely, and for the first time since my arrival I could see the mainland from the kitchen window, clear and present on the horizon, closer than I had imagined it. 6 weeks passed before I wrote any of this down. I want to be precise about that interval, because the 6 weeks were not empty. They were the opposite of empty. They were dense with the daily work of a life that had been reorganized around a new center of gravity, and the reorganization required attention, the careful kind, the kind that does not tolerate being split between the living of a thing and the simultaneous narrating of it. I have watched clients try to do both at once, and I have watched the narration win, watched the living get flattened into story before it had finished being experience, and I did not want to do that to what had happened on the island. So I waited. I let it be what it was, unwritten, alive in the body rather than the page for 6 weeks, and then on a Tuesday evening in January with the Portland streets white and quiet outside my apartment window, I opened the laptop and I began. This is what I wrote. Not this account. Not yet. What I wrote first was the session notes I had been avoiding. The accumulated paperwork of 15 years of practice that I had been deferring with increasing creativity since my mother's death. Pages and pages of clinical notation that had been waiting in their folders on my desktop like an unanswered correspondence. The professional version of new tape over cut tape. I wrote them all in one sitting, 4 hours, with the particular focused efficiency of someone doing overdue work without self-recrimination, because self-recrimination is a way of making the work about yourself rather than about the work, and the island had adjusted something in me on that question. I finished the session notes at 11 at night and closed the laptop and sat in my apartment in the dark for a while. The apartment was different. The box was open on the kitchen table. I had opened it the day I returned from the island, with my aunt sitting across from me, and we had spent the better part of 3 days with the journals spread between us, reading aloud in turns, my aunt with her tea and me with mine, both of us forgetting it in the way my mother had forgotten it, which felt appropriate, which felt like a kind of continuation. The journals were stacked now on the shelf above my desk, 31 volumes spanning 40 years, and I had read all of them, not in the 3 days with my aunt, but in the weeks since, 1 or 2 a night. The way you read something you understand to be finite and do not want to exhaust too quickly. My mother had been a remarkable writer. I do not mean technically remarkable, though the sentences were clean, and her eye for detail was precise in the way that belongs to people who pay genuine attention to the world around them. I mean remarkable in the sense that the journals were the record of an interior life I had underestimated severely and consistently, the interior life of a woman I had known for 28 years, and had assumed I understood because she was my mother, because the category of mother can be a way of not seeing the person inside it clearly. She had been funny, specifically, structurally funny, with a comic timing in her written voice that made me laugh aloud in my empty apartment on multiple occasions, alone, at 11 at night, at sentences she had written 20 years ago and never expected me to read. She had been uncertain about things I had assumed she was certain about. She had been proud of me in ways she had not known how to say directly, and had written around the directness in the journals with the circling approach of someone who has identified a feeling too large for a frontal approach and is instead triangulating it from multiple angles across multiple years, and the accumulation of those angles was more moving than a direct statement would have been, more specific, more hers. The things she had wanted to tell me, in the voicemail, in the call, I had not returned. I found it in the journal from the year before she died, written in the deliberate way of someone who has been working up to a sentence for a long time and is finally committing it to the page. She wrote, "I think Clara and I lost each other somewhere, and I think it was my fault as much as hers, and I have been waiting for the right moment to say so. And I have begun to understand that the right moment is a thing I have been inventing as a reason not to speak, and I do not have unlimited moments left, and I am going to call her." I read that entry 4 times on the night I found it. I sat on the kitchen floor with the journal in my lap and the apartment quiet around me, and I understood with a completeness that was not painful exactly, not anymore, but that had the weight of something true and important and irrevocable. She had been waiting too. She had been on the other side of the same silence, holding the same box closed with the same careful tape, and the difference between us was only that she had been the one to finally cut it, and I had not been there to answer. The grief counselor in me noted the symmetry with detached professional interest. The rest of me sat on the kitchen floor for a long time. I went back to work 2 weeks after returning from the island. A reduced caseload at first, 3 clients, then 5, then 8. By the end of January, I had been honest with my supervisor about what the leave of absence had involved, not in clinical terms, but in personal ones, which was a reversal of my habitual register with her, and she had listened with the quality of attention she was very good at, and then said, "You are going to be a different kind of counselor now." And the way she said it made clear she meant this as an observation rather than a judgment, and that the difference she perceived was not a deterioration. I thought about that often in the sessions of those first weeks back. I had always been good at the work in the technical sense, the right questions, the right silences, the correct calibration of presence and distance. What had changed was not the technique, but the location from which I was practicing it. And the location was closer now, less elevated, less protected by the glass wall of professional understanding that I had constructed so carefully and maintained so thoroughly across 15 years of sitting with other people's grief while keeping my own at its proper clinical distance. I was in the room now in a different way. Not compromised. I want to be precise about this, because the distinction matters and is frequently misunderstood. Not enmeshed, not over-identified, not carrying my own loss into the session as a contaminating presence, but present in the fuller sense, the sense that includes the acknowledgement that grief is not a condition that happens to other people, and that I have the expertise to observe and address. Grief is the condition of being alive long enough to love something and lose it, and every person in my office and I shared that condition, and the pretense that I was outside it had been costing both of us something we could not afford. The sessions were different. Better, I think. My supervisor thought so. 3 clients told me, in different words, that something had changed, and 2 of them said the change felt like an opening rather than a closing, which was the word I would have chosen. On a Thursday in late January, I received a letter from Ruth Calloway. Not a response. She had no way of knowing I had added to her letter, which was still on the island under the lantern with my own letter beneath it. This was a separate letter, sent to the Preservation Society's address and forwarded to me, in the same lined drugstore paper and the same strong handwriting, dated the first week of January. She wrote, "I heard from Roy that someone stayed the winter caretaker position this past November. I always pay attention when I hear that. I hope you found what you needed to find, and I hope the passage was what it has always been, which is a place where the carrying stops for long enough that you remember what you felt like before you picked the thing up. I think about the island often. I think about Margaret often, though I have no framework for what she is or how she persists. And I have stopped needing one. Some things are true without requiring a framework. My husband understood that, which is one of the things I understood from his letter when I finally read it. I do not expect you to write back. I only wanted someone who had been in that room to know that the room stays with you, and that this is not a haunting. It is a gift. There is a difference, and the difference is whether the presence wants something from you or gives something to you. She gives. She is always given. I am 73 years old, and I have thought about a great deal of things in my life, and what happened in that passage on that island is in the category of the things I am most grateful for, and I am grateful without understanding it, which is, I have decided, the correct relationship to have with certain kinds of grace. I folded the letter and kept it. I wrote back 2 weeks later, a single page, and I told her about the voicemail and the box and my aunt and the journals and the specific laugh that arrived before the sentence it belonged to. And at the end I wrote, "You were right that the weight changes form. I am still learning what form it has taken. I think it will take a while to know completely, and I think that is correct." I did not write about the lantern, because the lantern did not belong to the letter. The lantern was still on the island, on the bookcase, in the keeper's house, holding my letter under its iron base, waiting with the patient expertise of something that has been waiting a very long time, and knows the precise quality of attention that waiting requires. On the 1st of February, I contacted the Preservation Society and told them I would like to return in November, if the position was available. The woman I spoke to said she would note the preference. She said, "Roy will be glad to hear it." I did not ask how she knew Roy would be glad. I sat at my desk after the call with the phone still in my hand, and through the window the Portland street was white, and the sky was the particular gray of a winter afternoon surrendering to evening. And I thought about the island in this season, what it looked like now, the fog and the beam and the bell and the keeper's house, holding its warmth against the Atlantic cold, the passage in the north wall of the cellar warm with its particular warmth, the lantern on the bookcase in the main room, and the folded letters beneath it, accumulating, one from Marsh and one from Calloway and one from me, the correspondence of people who had gone through the dark and come back changed, addressed to whoever came next. My mother's journals were on the shelf above my desk, 31 volumes. I had been reading them 1 or 2 a night, but I had slowed in recent weeks, deliberately, consciously rationing what remained the way you ration something you understand to be finite and do not want to exhaust. I had perhaps 8 volumes left, perhaps 10 evenings of her voice in my apartment, her specific eye, her structural comedy, her circling approaches to the feelings too large for frontal address. I was not hurrying toward the end. I opened the laptop and began this account, not for the channel, not for a publisher, not for my supervisor or my aunt or Ruth Calloway or anyone I could name. I began it the way Edward Marsh had kept his journal, because the island belongs to something that outlasts the individual keeper, and what the keeper experiences on the island belongs to the record, and the record belongs to whoever comes next. Whoever Roy looks at on a dock in some future November and sees the particular quality of a person who has been carrying something long enough that the carrying has become invisible to them, but is entirely visible to someone who knows what to look for. I wrote for 3 hours without stopping. Outside, the Portland street went dark and the street lights came on, and somewhere below my window a car moved through the slushy intersection, and the sound of it was the ordinary sound of a city doing its ordinary work. And I sat inside that ordinariness and wrote, and the writing felt like the truest version of the witness I had been trying to practice for 15 years. The willingness to remain in the room with a thing until you have seen it clearly enough to say it back accurately. I gave this account its title on the night I finished it. The title was not clever and was not intended to be. It was simply the truest thing I could say about what Margaret had been doing on that island for 130 years, and what the island did to the people it called to it, and what I understood at last about the difference between the maintenance of a thing and the witnessing of it. I wrote the title at the top of the first page, and then I closed the laptop, and I made tea, and I forgot it immediately, and I sat in my apartment in the dark and let that be enough. I went back in November. Not to the island itself. Not yet. The return I had arranged with the society was for the following November, the full winter position, and that was still 12 months away, patient and certain on the calendar the way the things you have genuinely decided feel patient and certain rather than looming. The return I made in this November was smaller and more necessary than the official one, and it was not to the island but to the coast, to the mainland shore nearest the island's position, a stretch of granite headland outside a town called Wharton's Point that Roy had mentioned in passing on my second ferry crossing. In the way people mention landmarks, they do not think about consciously because they have always been there, the way you mention a tree you have been navigating by for 30 years, without ever considering the tree itself. I drove up from Portland on a Saturday morning in the second week of November. The drive was 2 hours north, then 20 minutes east on a road that narrowed progressively, shedding lanes, and then shoulders, and then the painted center line, until it was a single track of cracked asphalt running between spruce trees whose branches met overhead and turned the gray morning grayer. And then the spruce gave way to a brief open meadow, brown and flattened by the first cold weeks. And then the road ended at a small gravel lot with a rusted gate and a sign that said Wharton Point Preserve, and beyond the gate a trail through low coastal scrub toward the sound of water. I parked and sat in the car for a moment. I had the lantern on the passenger seat. I want to explain why I had brought it, because the explanation requires precision, and I have been committed to precision throughout this account, and will not abandon it in the final pages. When I had returned from the island the previous spring, I had left the lantern on the bookcase as I had intended, under my letter, and I had left Ruth Calloway's letter there as well, and Edward Marsh's journal in the cellar in the walnut box. I had done everything correctly, and then in June, when the summer caretaker arrived, a retired marine engineer from Bath, the society had told me, a man of 62 whose wife had died the previous winter, Roy had ferried him out, and 2 weeks later Roy had called me, which surprised me, because I had not given Roy my number and it had not occurred to me to wonder how he had obtained it. He said, "The summer caretaker found the lantern on the bookcase." I said, "Yes." He said, "He asked me what it was for." I said, "What did you tell him?" Roy was quiet for a moment, in the way Roy was quiet when he was deciding how much of an answer to give. Then he said, "I told him it belonged to the keeper before the last keeper, and that if he found the passage he would understand, and that the lantern was to be left for the one who came after." I said, "And did he find it?" Roy said, "He found it in the first week." He paused. He said, "He left the lantern where it was, but," he asked me, when I ferried him back in August, if it would be appropriate to leave something of his own on the island, something his wife had given him. I asked what Roy had told him. Roy said, "I told him anything left with good intention stays with good intention. The island knows the difference." He hung up before I could respond, which I had come to understand was simply how Roy ended conversations, not rudeness, but efficiency, the habit of a man who spent his working life at the intersection of necessity and weather, and had learned that the moment a thing was finished, it was finished, and the next thing was already requiring attention. In August, after that call, I had driven to the island. Not by ferry. The summer caretaker was in residence and I had no business being there, no official reason to interrupt his tenancy. But by the water, in a way. I had stood on a friend's boat in Penobscot Bay on a clear August afternoon and looked at the island from a distance, perhaps half a mile, close enough to see the white clapboard of the keeper's house and the cream-colored tower, and the lantern room dark in the summer daylight, and the low line of the island's profile against the water, which was the profile of something both very old and very present, something that had no interest in the past or the future as separate from the now. I had looked at it for a long time. Then my friend had turned the boat and we had gone back toward the mainland, and the island had reduced itself behind us to a line and then to a point and then to nothing, absorbed into the horizon the way all islands are absorbed when you move far enough away from them, as though they exist only for the people close enough to need them. Now I got out of the car. The trail through the coastal scrub was short, perhaps a quarter of a mile, and it opened onto a headland of bare granite shelving down toward the water in broad, flat steps. The stone was dark with recent rain, and the cold was the cold of a November coast, specific, aquatic, carrying the smell of salt and wet granite and kelp exposed at low tide. The smell I had been breathing for the past year in memory and was now breathing in fact, and my body received it with a recognition that was almost proprioceptive, a full-body acknowledgement. This place, this smell, this cold. The fog was in. Not the total fog of the island, not that complete erasure of everything beyond 40 yards that I had lived inside for months. A coastal fog, softer, moving. The kind that thickens and thins in response to the wind off the water so that visibility shifted every few minutes. Sometimes 100 yards, sometimes 30, sometimes a brief clearing in which the whole expanse of the bay was visible, gray and cold and immense, and then the fog returned and the expanse contracted, and the world reduced again to the headland and the water immediately below it, and the sound of a bell buoy somewhere to the east, ringing in the swells. I carried the lantern to the edge of the headland. I sat down on the granite, which was cold through my jeans in the precise and grounding way that the cellar floor had been cold through my jeans 11 months ago, and I held the lantern in both hands, and I looked out into the fog in the direction where the island was, which I knew by compass bearing and by the particular quality of the fog in that direction, which was slightly thicker, slightly more concentrated, as though the island's accumulated years of fog were denser than the surrounding water's fog, heavier with history. I could not see the island. I could feel it. I had brought the lantern because what Roy had told me about the marine engineer's wife had clarified something I had been working out since I returned from the island in the spring. Something about what the lantern was and what it was not. It was not a relic. It was not a museum object or a keepsake or a symbol of anything that required decoding. It was a tool, and its function was the function it had always had, which was to be carried by someone who needed to move through darkness towards something that needed reaching, and to be the visible evidence of that person's willingness to go. Margaret had carried it into a storm. She had not come back, but the light had persisted in the specific way that certain kinds of light persist. Not in the lantern itself, which had been empty of oil for 130 years, but in the act the lantern represented, which was the act of going toward what needed you in the dark, which was the act of witness, which was the act that the island had been teaching to its keepers for as long as there had been keepers to teach. I thought about my mother's journals on the shelf above my desk. I had finished them in September. The last volume had ended 3 weeks before her death, in the diminished handwriting of a woman whose hands were no longer entirely cooperating with her intentions. And the final entry had been 2 sentences. She had written, "I have been thinking about Clara." I think she is going to be all right. I had sat with those two sentences for a long time. I was sitting with them still, in the way that certain sentences do not finish their work quickly but continue their slow completion across months and years, settling deeper with each reading, finding new angles, new registrations of what is contained in them. The faith of the first sentence, the specific verb of the second. Not she will be all right, not I hope she will be all right, but the present continuous, the ongoing, the she is going, as though my mother in her last weeks had been able to see something in me that I could not yet see in myself, as though she had been watching the process already underway and had recorded its progress with the precise observational honesty that characterized her 40 years of daily writing. I think she is going to be all right. The fog moved. A brief clearing opened to the east, and in it, for perhaps 15 seconds, I could see the island. Not clearly, not in detail, but as a presence, a darker density against the gray water, the suggestion of a tower, the white clapboard of the keeper's house, catching what thin light was available, and holding it for the duration of the clearing. Then the fog came back and the island was gone. I held the lantern. The bell buoy rang in the swells, not the fog bell, not Margaret's bell, but the ordinary navigational bell of the working bay, patient and functional, and without intention beyond its function, which was to tell whatever was moving through the dark that something solid was here, that the water had a geography, that the geography could be navigated if you were willing to slow down and listen. I thought about the marine engineer from Bath and the object he had left on the island, the thing his wife had given him, placed with the lantern and the letters on the bookcase in the keeper's house. I did not know what it was. I did not need to know. It was on the shelf with the warped Thoreau, and the coverless thrillers, and the accumulated objects of every keeper who had come and understood and left something for the next one. And the shelf was becoming, slowly and without intention, the record of a particular kind of passage that happened on that island. Not the physical passage through the stone wall, but the interior one, the passage from one way of carrying a thing to another. I would add to it next November. I did not yet know what I would leave. The right object would make itself known the way the right things make themselves known, not through decision, but through recognition, the body understanding before the mind has assembled its rationale. A journal entry, perhaps, a letter to whoever came after me, or something of my mother's, something from the 31st volume, a page she had written in the diminished handwriting of her last weeks, offered not as a relic, but as evidence. The evidence of a woman who paid genuine attention to the world, who forgot her tea when she was talking, who chose love over the account of grievances, who watched her daughter from a distance with the faith of someone who understood that the distance was not the whole story. The fog thickened, the bell buoy rang. I sat on the granite headland with the lantern in my hands, and I breathed the salt and the cold and the kelp, and I let the island be where it was, 12 miles out in the gray water, holding its warmth in the passage and its light in the turning beam and its patience in the 6-stroke cycle of the fog bell, patient as it had always been, as it would be when I returned, as it would be after I had come and gone for the last time, as it would be for whoever came after that, generation after generation of people who arrived on the dock in November carrying something they had been carrying too long, and who found in the granite and the dark and the warm room under the cellar the specific grace of being witnessed by something that had chosen, across an unimaginable span of November nights, to stay. I set the lantern on the granite beside me. I put both hands flat on the cold stone, the way I had pressed them against the cellar wall, the way Edward Marsh had pressed his in November 1933. The way the body understands that some surfaces hold what has passed through them, and that the right pressure and the right attention and the right quality of stillness is enough, sometimes, to feel it, The granite was cold. The cold was precise. The fog bell began, out on the island, its 6-stroke cycle. Faint at this distance, barely audible above the bell buoy and the water moving against the headland below me, requiring the particular quality of listening that you use only for things you genuinely want to hear. I counted the strokes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The silence after the 6th was the silence of open water in November, wide and gray and clean, a silence with room in it, a silence that could hold what needed holding without effort, without cost, simply by being what it was, which was large enough. I waited. The silence continued. I picked up the lantern, and I stood, and I looked out into the fog where the island was and was not, and I did not wait for the 7th stroke, because I understood. Standing on that headland in the cold, with the lantern in my hand, and my mother's last words still doing their slow, patient work in the place where they had landed, that the 7th stroke was not something given to you from outside. It was something that rang in you when you were finally ready to hear it. And I was at last ready. I walked back to the car through the spruce corridor, the lantern swinging lightly in my hand, and the fog came with me as far as the tree line, and then stopped, as fog sometimes stops at a boundary, as though it understood that this particular stretch of ground was no longer where it needed to be. I drove back to Portland in the clear.
Thank you for watching my video. Hope you like, and we will see you again. Bye.